Welcome to VCR, Vintage Cinema Rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
Game over! Game over, man!
I knew you were going to bring that one up because this is the right movie. We're doing Aliens.
Yeah.
It's maybe one of the most quoted parts of the entire movie because it's hilarious.
I think this might actually be one of my favorite Bill Paxton performances too, right?
It's up there.
He's just so himself in this movie. You know what I mean?
You can tell he's having a lot of fun. Yes.
Yeah, no kidding.
He's just hamming it up.
I was just rewatching the scene earlier today where they're doing their debriefing and the sergeant is like, any questions? He sticks his hand up and he's like, how do I transfer out of this chicken shit unit?
Yeah, he's just such a wise ass for the first 30 minutes and then things change.
And you know what? If it were anyone other than Bill Paxton, the character would be insufferable, but because it's Bill Paxton, you're like, that Hudson, he's a funny guy.
Yeah, we'll get into effects and filming of this in the second episode later, because I have some thoughts about Bill Paxton's performance and his methodology on that. But we are talking about Aliens. This is our part 3 of our Aliens Sigourney Weaver series, where, we've been looking at Sigourney Weaver's career, specifically through the Alien movies, at this point in time.
Yeah, I feel like we should do more Sigourney Weaver movies too. I mean,
yeah,
I feel like we kind of took the cliche approach with her filmography, where it's like, oh, Sigourney Weaver, Alien and Aliens, but she's done a lot of stuff. Actually, last year on a very, very, very bad date, I watched what's that Joss Whedon movie from 2012, Cabin in the Woods or something, the horror.
Is
comedy.
she in that one?
She shows up right at the end.
Oh,
and
okay.
it's like, oh, hey, it's Sigourney Weaver, and she's really good.
Yeah.
She plays the quote unquote.
Yeah.
Maybe I shouldn't even say because it's kind of a spoiler.
Yeah, you shouldn't. You shouldn't say because that movie actually is really good.
Yeah. Hey guys, remember when we liked Joss Whedon?
Yeah.
2012 was such a different time.
Yeah, that's a solid movie. I didn't even know that was him who wrote that.
You know what's funny? It's 2024 now as we're recording this. I'm saying this for the benefit of our future listeners, but it's funny. I graduated college in 2012, and sometimes when I think back to that, I'll be like, oh, well, 10 years ago. But then I have to do the math in my head now. I'm like, actually, 12 years ago when I graduated college.
Yeah. Too long ago.
Yeah.
We're so old. But we're off on the wildest of tangents here. Let's circle back to the movie we're talking about and the person we're talking about, Aliens, the sequel to Alien, considered one of the greatest sequels of all time, and probably for good reason, honestly, out of the gates.
Certainly one of the most interesting sequels of all time, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's so interesting. I have a lot to say about it.
Oh yeah, we're definitely going to be having a pretty deep discussion in the spoiler-full episode following this one about the comparing and contrasting this movie to Alien, because they're not even quite the same genre, which is wild.
No, and yet same series, and as we will discover, they follow the two movies follow very, very similar beats.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so let's get into the plot summary really quick.
So many, many years after the Nostromo blowed up and Ripley's crew got... Wait, is it Ripley or Ridley?
Ripley.
Right, okay,
You're
it's
right.
Ridley Scott. I was
Yes.
rewatching our episode yesterday, and I saw the moment where I got stumbled up on that.
And then I got stumbled up on it too because you were saying it, and I then
Right.
started saying it in the episode, and I was like, God damn it.
Because my stupidity is infectious. But
yeah,
let's
I was
start-
editing it and I was just so frustrated with both of us.
Okay, so anyways, many years after the incident aboard the Nostromo, Ellen Ripley and the cat are discovered in cryosleep. She is quickly unthawed, and it turns out that her corporate overlords, who are named this time around, i.e. Weyland-Yutani, Weyland-Yutani, something like that.
Yutani.
Anyways, they are none too pleased that everyone is dead and she blew up like $1 billion freighter because of rumors of an alien life form running around, right? Mm-hmm. On top of losing her job and being declared unfit for command, Ripley is also struggling with nightmares and post-traumatic stress about the xenomorph. And compounding things, it turns out that the A planet where they discovered the crashed alien ship has now become a human settlement. It's been terraformed, which Ripley has thoughts about. But then, as it turns out, the human colony goes completely dark. And the company decides to lead a rescue mission, and they want Ripley to tag along for, like, intel, right?
Yeah.
And that's pretty much the plot. It's Ripley overcoming her trauma by drastically re-traumatizing herself.
Well, yeah, it's almost like a redemption arc, right? Like her going back and being able to try to save like the colony from the alien, maybe alien insurgency,
something like that. This is really, by the way, when we talk about like, when you ask people about like the best female action heroes in movies, most people come to Ripley, and this is the movie they're thinking of when they think of Ripley. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah.
In the first movie, she was like kind of this clever survivor. In this movie, she kind of starts kicking ass.
Yeah, and that kind of, I was thinking about this, and I was planning on talking about this more in the deep dive episode, but in a sense, it almost makes this movie feel like the core to the Alien franchise, whereas the Alien almost becomes like a prequel series to the character of Ellen Ripley in a way.
That's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. It's almost like there's The Hobbit and then there's The Lord of the Rings.
Right, yeah, and that's kind of how I almost look at these two movies. And we'll talk about more about like our opinions of which movie is better, which one we like better, all of that sort of stuff in the deep dive episode, I think. But that's just kind of how I look at it because of the way her character arc comes full circle in this movie, and she becomes like the heroine badass that, you know, we picture in our minds, like you said.
Yeah.
So characters and people you may know, obviously Sigourney Weaver returning as Ellen Ripley. This is coming in 1986, which is about 7 years after the original, or 8 years after the original. I can't remember now.
And I think that's kind of actually like an interesting point that we should talk about. The fact that, like, you know, whereas most Hollywood movies, like, there's a sequel within 2 or 3 years, this was like a full almost decade later.
Yeah. When we get into the deep dive as well, right? Like, we can even talk about, you know, the fact that this movie did kind of change with the times a little bit as well. Like, each movie in the series is kind of a reflection of the decade in which it was filmed.
Yeah, and I think I said this in our last episode that, like, Alien is very much a 70s movie because you've got, like, the economic angst and, like, the class struggles and, like, the bleak horror tone. This is definitely an 80s movie with all the cheese and spectacle and bombast that comes with that.
Yeah. So Sigourney Weaver, I found her, so I actually was looking at her kind of career, like, and we kind of talked about this a few minutes ago, but she has a really interesting career because, you know, Alien was the movie that put her on the map, and then between Alien and Aliens, she does Ghostbusters, which becomes one of the, like, most famous comedies of all time.
Oh, yeah.
But the other movies that she did in that time period, I wouldn't say are, like, massive hits. There's a movie that's called The Year of Living Dangerously, which stars her alongside Mel Gibson, which is, you know, pretty large name in the 80s cinema.
Hey guys, remember when we liked Mel Gibson?
Yeah, I guess this is the way back playback of all of those names that are no longer maybe super popular anymore. But anyway, this is a movie that I have definitely seen the poster for because it's a freaking sick poster.
Yeah,
and I've never seen this movie before, and it won a lot of awards at the time it came out. So I feel like it's a movie that we'll probably cover at some point in time, and it's on our list now because I think it looks pretty cool. But
okay, yeah, I'm down.
And it's also directed by Peter Weir, which is neat. But otherwise, like, the other movies that she does between this and Aliens, I wouldn't say are, you know, massive movies. Subsequently, following Alien, she has a hit like once every 5 years. I would say she has a movie that's insanely famous, but she has a really interesting career, and I think part of it as well is because she also like had a really strong stage career. So she kind of like bounces between being on stage and being in film for most of her career, honestly. Like, if you look at her list of theater performances and kind of compare them up with her film performances, like, the list is not quite as long, but it's not that far off.
No, it's It's quite a list, that's for sure.
And the other thing I find that's really interesting about her career is how she kind of becomes like a frequent collaborator with James Cameron, the director, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we might as well talk about James Cameron now, like directing this. You know, James Cameron is a Canadian filmmaker who at this point is borderline a household name because of the Avatar movies, because of Titanic, because of the Terminator series. Like, he's one of the most famous and prominent directors of the last generation, I would say. Like, he is incredibly important to film history, and whether or not you like all of his movies or whether or not you even like just different components of his movies, like this movie is really interesting to his career because I find that it's really the movie that establishes all of the James Cameron in-universe ideas and tropes and stuff that he kind of, you know, spends a lot of his other movies either grappling with or redoing, or even like the sci-fi elements. Like, for example, the cargo loader. That's something that like almost is like a prototype for the exosuits and the Avatar movies and stuff like that. So it's a really interesting point in his career, and I think that if you haven't seen this movie and you've seen a lot of James Cameron's other stuff, this one's a really cool one to go back to because a lot of the ideas that he uses in later movies are thought of and created right in this moment.
This is kind of the movie where James Cameron really just settled into James Cameron.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, like hadn't even had that many movies at the point this came out. Like, he had done Piranha 2 and he had done The Terminator. Like, he had literally just done The Terminator, and that was it. Like, he really, like, this is his second big mainstream movie at this point in time.
Yeah, no kidding. This is James Cameron becoming James Cameron.
Yeah. The other characters of the movie that we should talk about, so there's Burke, the finance bro guy who's kind of leading this mission from the Weyland-Yutani Corp perspective. I think that this is a really great performance from Paul Reiser. He plays like such a sleazy dirtbag so well. You almost come to love to hate this character.
What I love the most about this character is how like he is a sleazy dirtbag, and this is kind of a spoiler, but like you kind of like the guy at first. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like he's again,
he's a schmoozer.
He's a schmoozer, and
he schmoozes the audience.
He almost kind of seems like a pseudo love interest for Ripley. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, he's good looking, he's charming, he seems very reasonable. It's not until like late in the movie where you're like, oh no, he's a, you know, this tech bro is going to sell us all out.
Yeah, exactly. I find what's really cool about this performance is it also just feels like foreshadowing the next 30 years of Western civilization, and like these are the people who are going to rule this world that we now live in, basically, is these like tech bro wearing the sweater vest, like down to a T. He is what we picture when we think of tech bro.
Like, what do you call it? Like the banality of evil.
Yeah. Paul Reiser, I just wanted to mention him as an actor because I've been watching a lot of his stuff lately. He's the dad in Whiplash, which is one of my favorite movies the last 15 years. He was in a show called Red Oaks playing the dad of that. He's kind of become, like, over the last like 20 years, like, movie and television dad.
He's just become the dad. That's cool.
He's also in the Beverly Hills Cop movie series. He's the deputy chief, and that includes the new Beverly Hills Cop movie that's being advertised on Netflix. I haven't actually seen any of those movies before, so I can't really comment on any of them, but no.
I saw the first couple on cable when I was a kid, and I remember really liking them.
Yeah, I get my cop movies. That's kind of like a hole that I have in my filmography. Like, I get them all confused, like between that and Lethal Weapon and Bad Boys and Rush Hour.
I've never seen any of the Lethal Weapon movies.
I have seen at least one, maybe two of them, but very long ago. Like, I was probably too young to have watched those movies. They were on TV at some point.
It's funny how, by the way, kids, like, this is how Blake and I used to watch movies. They'd just be on TV, and our parents would just let us watch them. That's how we got our education. That's why we're doing this podcast now.
Yeah, exactly. And then, so there's like the gang of military guys as well. And so I'm not going to get into details of every one of the characters. I'm just going to talk about some of the characters who have really strong acting performances in them. You know, we've already mentioned Bill Paxton as Private Hudson. This is just like an all-time funny military performance. Like in the first 20-30 minutes, he's just like so unlikably cocky and sarcastic and just like such a prick, and then things quickly change after that first 30 minutes or so.
Yeah, we've all met a guy like Hudson, right? Who is like way more confident that they have any right to be. And
Yeah,
then the second things stop going well for them, you see who they really are. And
exactly.
you're just like, buddy.
Yeah. Bill Paxton, like, I mean, gone too early. He passed away, I think, at 61, like 10 or so years ago now.
Is Bill
Which
Paxton
is wild.
dead?
Yeah,
Oh
Bill
my
Paxton,
gosh.
like, I think he had cancer or something. He died like 10 years ago.
Oh, he died in 2017. You're right.
Yeah. So, like, we didn't get, all of the maybe older dad performances from him necessarily, but he's still in, like, he's in, like, every James Cameron movie, basically. He's in the movie Twister, which is having a sequel that's out, like, I think this week. Twisters, which has, like, a ton of hype. He's just, like, one of those guys who's just, you're always excited when he's in the movie because he kind of just makes every movie that much better.
Yeah.
And then we have Corporal Hicks, who's played by Michael Biehn, who's another James Cameron collaborator. You're going to know him as Kyle Reese from the Terminator franchise. Very distinct looking guy. Absolutely one of the most charismatic actors of the 80s, I would say. Like, he's a guy that every time you see him in a movie, you're like, how is that guy not one of the like biggest movie stars of all time? Because every one of his performances are so good. And like, I would put his performance of like charisma on like a level of like Tom Cruise charisma. Like, there's just something about him that makes him stand out to me. So I got reading all about his career and like why he didn't end up going on becoming like the Tom Cruise of his generation, but really interesting read.
It's kind of too bad because he really shines in this movie too. He's almost like the most likable person in the movie.
Yeah, I agree. And like, that's the thing, is like, he's also that same guy in the Terminator series as well, right? Like, he's such a likable person, but big part of it is he didn't really want that life. Like, he was picking smaller movies, like he was just picking stuff that he wanted to do rather than like big budget movies. So
I can respect that.
yeah, so he has a really interesting career that I think I would like to just personally dive into maybe a little bit more on the side at some point, because I think he, some of the movie choices he made were a lot of personal choices. So I think that's kind of neat. Bishop is the android on the ship. So if you've seen the movie Alien, which I'm assuming most of you have at this point, that plays a prominent role in the first movie. This is one of the first like strong contrasting elements to this film and the other film, is they take something from the first Alien movie and they kind of flip it on its head.
Yeah. Bishop might have actually been my favorite character in the movie.
Yeah, and I mean, that's it. We talked about last time how the android in the first movie, Ash, is one of our favorite performances and actors in the first movie as well. It's interesting because, how the first movie almost makes that something that becomes like a big twist, right, later on in the film, whereas in this movie we know right away, and Ripley like responds to the fact that he's an android right away. So
Viscerally,
and this is something which we'll talk about in the deep dive episode, but in the first 30 minutes we almost take like all of the big elements of the first movie and just like throw them on screen and basically like say like, here's all the stuff that you're expecting from this movie. You're expecting us to retread all of this. Here's that all out of the way. Let's get into like what this movie is really going to be about for the next hour and a half.
Right, because some stuff gets subverted, some of it gets turned on its head, and then some of it is kind of just recycled. Not in a bad way, but recycled.
Yeah, like you said, it's one of the more interesting performances of the entire movie. He's played by Lance Henriksen, did a ton of voice work in the 90s and 2000s. You're going to know him as Kerchak the gorilla in Tarzan, which I'm not sure if I pronounced that right.
I think you were close.
Okay. He's a prominent voice actor in the Call of Duty video game series. He is a prominent voice actor in the Mass Effect video game series. Like, you have heard his voice before in other video games, TV, movies, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last character that I want to mention is Newt, one of the colonists. When they arrive, they meet. She's this little girl. Her actor actually never acted again after this movie. She was kind of like a find. They wanted somebody who was fresh, who was new, that didn't have any connections to anything else. They found her, and then she decided not to pursue acting afterwards. I thought her performance as like the kid actor was like one of the stronger elements of the movie as well. Like kids can be really hit or miss in movies, and she did an outstanding performance in this one.
It's kind of a shame she decided not to pursue acting, because I would have liked to have seen what more she was capable of, you know?
No, I think she does an incredible job. And then we've talked about James Cameron already, so who is this movie for? Does it hold up to a modern watch?
So this is my second time viewing this movie. I watched it a couple years ago with my old roommate, and then I watched it again for this. And I feel like I hate being that guy, and people always accuse me of being this guy, but I do feel like it dragged a little in certain parts.
Really?
Yeah.
That surprises me because I actually had the exact opposite experience. I thought that this movie moves at such a brisk pace that after the first 30 minutes that like I never really feel like I'm bored or like stalling out on anything. Like I thought this movie held up extraordinarily well.
Okay, and that might just be a matter of taste, but I did feel there were times where I was like, okay, like come on guys, let's get a move on here. Yeah. Although I will say the third act in particular is spectacular.
Yeah. What I'll say is that I think that this is a more widespread appeal than Alien. Alien being like, you know, a extreme focus on the horror elements. It's lower budget. The pacing is like very slow. It's very intentionally slow, but it's very slow nonetheless. Whereas this is more of an action movie than a horror movie.
Mm-hmm.
It does include like action elements. It's rated R, and you know it goes out of the way to use that R rating to come up with some pretty horrific special effects. But I think that general audiences are gonna really have a lot of fun with this one still, even in 2024.
Okay.
Now, do you think that you need to watch Alien to enjoy the full Aliens experience?
See, and that's the thing. So, for those of you keeping track of the Vintage Cinema Rewind lore, I thought we were doing a double feature last episode, so I watched both of them before. Yeah, that's the one time I was more prepared than you, and it was by accident. So, I actually think when you watch them side by side, they do kind of form like a very interesting duology. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like the two movies start talking to each other in a weird way.
Yes. I really agree with you. And what I'll say is so I've watched obviously both of these movies quite a bit. Like I've seen both these movies not quite a dozen times, probably like 6 to 8 times, I would say. And I've never watched one or the other movie without watching the other one at the same time. Like I always watch both movies within the same month of each other.
That's interesting. So I saw Alien, I'm going to say it again, 12 years ago and in college, and I was like, that was interesting. And then I didn't see Aliens until 10 years later when I was living with my friend, the other Michael, and we watched it together one night. And
Michael Jackson? Yeah,
Michael Jackson. And not to be confused with the other Michael I'm about to move in with, but...
Michael Jordan?
Yeah, exactly. It's all the Michaels. So anyways, there was 10 years between Alien and Aliens, and then this month I watched the two of them back to back, and I was like, oh, interesting. Like when you see them side by side, they really do kind of
pop.
Form. They really do pop, which is... I think it's really interesting, again, the fact that there was like an 8-year gap between Alien and Aliens in real life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's almost kind of like Inside Out 2 is like the biggest movie in the universe right now. And again, I think that's another one where it's like, I was looking at the dates and I was like, has there really been 9 years since the last Inside Out movie? And I'm like, there's no way the sequel's going to work. And then apparently it's working wonders. So what do I know? But
yeah, for sure.
Maybe that's maybe that's the secret. You just have to stall the sequel for as long as possible, and then it might just be a huge phenomenon.
Well, I think that honestly, if you're not necessarily, I should rephrase this. Studios are, at the end of the day, a business that is looking to make money. And so for a lot of studios, it does make sense to immediately go back into the well and recapitalize on a successful IP. But I think that oftentimes that actually works against any sequel movie because it can either feel rushed or it's not fleshed out. Like,
Or it's to their detriment. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so in some of these cases where obviously the Alien movie was extraordinarily successful when it came out, and there was immediately some appetite for that movie. Now, different time, sci-fi movies not as big then. We're also at the tail end of slasher films, and like, you could think of Alien as a haunted house slasher film if you really want to extend that thought
In
to
space.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the studio itself was somewhat a little bit more hesitant to do it, and that just kind of lets all of the ideas kind of simmer for a little bit longer and fully flesh themselves out, right?
Well, then I think that's, again, what makes these two movies so interesting is the fact that, like, we got our sequel like 8 years later, but it was in a completely different genre. Suddenly it's a fucking action movie.
Right.
And I'm sure there's debate online as to like whether or not this was a good move for the Alien franchise, but it is very, very interesting. Like, is there another case like this where like there's a movie and then there's a sequel, but the sequel it's continuing the same narrative, but it's a completely different genre? Like, is there any other example we can think of that?
I mean, not off like the immediate top of my head per se. I guess this one's kind of a weird one, and I've brought this up so many times, but like the Evil Dead series.
Yeah, I was gonna bring up Evil Dead 2. Like, haha, pun intended. Evil Dead #2. The one that's more of a comedy than a straight horror.
I think that maybe horror is the best genre to be able to like capitalize on that, to move from horror into like more horror comedy or maybe horror action, that sort of thing. I think this is maybe one of the first cases of it, and probably one of the most successful, and that kind of maybe opened the doors a little bit more to doing something like this. And it's not something that happens frequently, like you said. And I think, again, part of that is because of audience expectations, right? Like if you were to take, I don't even know, Indiana Jones and make Indiana Jones from like an action adventure story into a family drama, then you end up with the Dial of Destiny. and we know what happened there, right? But
we do indeed. I think that's the one movie I've actually walked out of.
And I didn't hate that movie. I despised what they tried to do with the family idea and old Indy and that sort of focus. But anyway, that's a conversation for another time. So I honestly don't think that you have to see Alien to have seen Aliens, but I think that it's extraordinarily, they're so complementary to each other, and I have such a deep love for both movies that I honestly think that you really should watch both of them together to get the full scope of them. And like you said, like they do kind of become like a really interesting duology against each other.
I was going to talk about this in the spoiler section, but I'm going to bring it up now. There's a great scene early on in this movie where Ripley is being interrogated by the suits about why the Nostromo is in a million pieces. And it's a great scene because they do sneak exposition in there where you're like, yes. Oh, okay, cool. Like, this is what happened in the last movie. Like, and I think that was smart because of the fact that there was 8 years between these two movies. It's just like, Hey, audience, do you remember what happened in 1979? Okay, here you go.
Exactly. And we're definitely going to talk about that in a lot more detail when we get into the deep dive, because I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think that's maybe like this movie is extraordinarily intelligent, and you can tell like the creative artistic work behind the scenes and making like a script this cinematic. Like that's what James Cameron's great at, right? Is making like for really cinematic moments in movies, and I think that this is maybe one of the best. And like I've got like almost like a highlight reel of those scenes that I want to talk about in the deep dive.
Nice.
The one scene to sell a movie. So funny enough, Aliens doesn't really have like a movie clips, like the movie clips YouTube channel series for it, but what I did find was a separate Aliens movie clip series, and it basically has a movie clip for almost every single scene of the movie. Like it's literally almost every single scene in the movie in movie clip form, which I find both hilarious that they were able to get away with that, and also like awesome that this movie has so many great moments in it that you can pretty much clip any single 3 to 5 minute like clip out of this movie and it just be rewatchable and on YouTube for your enjoyment.
Yeah.
So the scene that I picked is called Let's Rock, and I'll have that obviously in the description, but it's the scene where the Marines head down into the terraforming, whatever you call it, building to find all of the missing settlers. And it's the scene that, you know, things turn from like a macho Marine Corps movie into something else.
Something decidedly not that.
Yeah, and so it's a scene that I think it's relatively early on in the movie. It's in like the first 30 minutes, and it's probably the best scene with like very little spoilers that blends what I think are the core elements of this film: the action, the horror, and the sci-fi.
Yeah, I would probably second that choice just because when I do think about this movie, I do think about this scene. Because this is the scene where everything kind of. It's almost kind of like the diner scene in Alien. It's just way, way more over the top.
Yeah, and it just, you know, it also flips the idea of what you think this movie is going to be on its head.
It's kind of funny. Like, if you want to know the difference between Alien and Aliens, it's like, look at the diner scene in Alien and then this scene in Aliens. These are the two most upsetting, horrifying scenes, and just look at the contrast between them. That's all you need to know about these two movies.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And it's just like, it's such a good scene on its own as well. So highly recommend it. It's 4 minutes and it just builds like, in that little scene even, it just builds an incredible amount of tension, and then we do get like the exciting release of that tension all in that scene. When to watch: this is a big blockbuster movie. Like, this is a Saturday night movie for me. I will say that like you can watch this movie at literally any time because it just rocks really hard. And like, I watched this during the week. Jess and I were both just fully enveloped in this. Like, I could be tired and, you know, be sitting up in my seat waiting for what's going to happen next kind of thing. Like, it's just a very big, explosive movie that, like I said, you can watch it any time, but like, this is kind of one of those tentpole Saturday night kind of movies.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I did watch this Saturday night as well, so there we are.
Nice. Where to watch? Right now, it's streaming on Disney Plus. I will say that, and I might circle back to this a little bit later, that so Disney Plus has every Alien movie in existence on it to stream. So for better or worse, there's a lot of Alien movies on there. What I'll say though is that for whatever reason, Disney Plus only has the theatrical releases of these films on its website to stream. And I've actually only ever seen the director's cut of the movie Aliens.
Really?
So, yes. So there are like some key scenes that were cut out of the movie that I almost like felt like, because I didn't realize that I had only ever seen the director's cut and this was the theatrical. So I kept being like having fever dreams of like these scenes that were missing from this movie that I was expecting. Yeah. And I think they're really cool and I want to talk about those later. But I think that for our purposes, because you and I are talking about movies in 2024 and where people are going to find movies more or less at this point is almost exclusively through streaming.
Or through us.
Yeah, I think that it's somewhat disappointing, and I'm going to get into this in more detail when we get into the spoiler section, but I think it's a little disappointing that these kind of streaming platforms aren't uploading what's considered the best film version of these films to their streaming platforms. I think that's really disappointing, you know, that people are going to like, you know, the casual audience is just going to find this movie and watch the version that's online and have no idea that there's other versions, that there's, you know, deeper plot ideas and scenes that they're missing.
I guess it's a matter of some debate though whether the director's cut supersedes the theatrical cut. Like not in this version, but like it's kind of funny. I remember when we did The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly last October for my 31st birthday. Haha. I have only ever seen the theatrical cut of that movie, but I somehow stumbled across the director's cut on YouTube. And it's funny, I was having kind of a similar experience where there'd be a scene where like Tuco is skinning a chicken and I'd be like, what the fuck is going on? Like, am I having a stroke? I've seen this movie a billion times. What's going on? Right? So, but I see your point.
It's definitely an interesting comparison, right? Like, I'm looking at the Lord of the Rings DVDs over up on my shelf behind me there, but even those, like some movies, I guess that's the debate about art too, right? Like, what's the better version? Is the director's cut always the actual superior version? I mean, generally speaking, a lot of like movies that get a director's cut are movies that are considered classics that, there's demand to see on alternate versions. Sometimes it is just like the version that was released was maybe incomplete or not to what the director wanted. They didn't have final cut, etc. And so later on, somebody allowed them to have a final cut, director's cut version of a film. Sometimes you're just George Lucas and you play with your movie for 40 years.
Jesus Christ, yeah.
But I think that there's usually a general consensus online with film fanatics what the ultimate version of a specific film is. And I think that these streaming services do a bit of a disservice to these films and like the longevity of some of these films in not having at least the option to watch like different versions of a film.
It'd be funny if you went to like Disney Plus and you clicked on Blade Runner and a new menu popped up and it's like, do you want the theatrical cut? Do you want the director's cut? Or do you want the final cut? There's probably another cut in there I'm forgetting.
Oh, there's at least like 6 cuts of that movie, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, no kidding.
But think about that though. Like think about how that extends that movie and the rewatchability of that movie. And like there people will create like arguments online about which version of that is the ultimate version of that, like that sort of thing. Like I think that there's so much that's left off of the table in just putting the theatrical release on a streaming platform. Not even like no reference whatsoever to the fact that there's maybe a different version of this movie that's available somewhere or that, this is the theatrical version or something like that. I think that just is going to do a disservice to film over time.
Well, and then there's a broader argument about whether or not streaming services are even good for film. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like a lot,
for sure.
A lot of shit gets lost in the shuffle. You know what I mean? Can I share a story from my own life? Can I drop some Michael lore, as the kids are calling it? So it's funny you should say.
Michael lore.
So I signed with a literary agent back in February to represent my second book. And it's funny, this book that I've been working on for a few years now, one of my friends, Patrick, I had sent him an earlier draft of the book, which he was supposed to read, and he never got around to it. And then randomly, one day last summer, he's like, yo, I finished your book. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, I finished your book, and I have thoughts. And I'm like, bro, I've done like 2 whole rounds of revisions since I gave you that version. What do you mean you read my book? And I was like, you should have told me you were going to read it. I would send you the most recent version. So it's funny. I had to send him the most recent version. And then he was like, okay, some of the complaints I had were addressed in your revisions. And I'm like, thank you. But then it's funny. I signed with this literary agent. So now there's been a whole new round of revisions in that time.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I think that, like in a lot of cases, revisions are a good thing, but like we all know that studios like to tamper with movies, and there's like studio heads in particular who may not be in their role for creative reasons at the end of the day are trying to sell a movie and make a financial gain on these, because you have to have some sort of financial gain on these movies to make them successful. And a lot of times stuff gets cut or lost or edited that would have enhanced the viewer experience because the director had a very specific intention for those scenes.
Right, and then very, very occasionally, the studio interference actually makes the movie better. Like, they created Ash in the first movie.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's hit or miss, right? Like, no option there is perfect. Like, there's no instance of there's one size fits all kind of thing with movies, but, or with any art in general. But that's my rant for the episode. I think that's actually all that I had for our primer episode of Aliens before we get into our spoiler full deep dive episode. So, I guess see you next time. Tell your dad.
Tell your dad.
And actually, before we end this, I'm gonna try to do this a little bit more in our movie series. But you and I talked about the next movie that we'll be doing in a couple weeks now, and I want to like actually start announcing our movies a little bit in advance so that people can watch them if they're kind of following along with us. So we are doing a thriller after we're done with our deep dive episode of Aliens, and we're doing the thriller The Talented Mr. Ripley. Have you ever seen The Talented Mr. Ripley?
No, and that's kind of why I wanted to do it. The only thing I know about The Talented Mr. Ripley is that what I gleaned from it from reading The Disaster Artist. So it sounds interesting to me.
Nice.
Also, I think it's funny that we're doing The Talented Mr. Ripley after doing Sigourney Weaver Month.
Oh, true. Yeah, I didn't even think about and also the fact that the character's name is also Ripley.
Yeah, that's right. I was like,
yeah,
that's pretty funny.
Nice. All right. Well, expect that in about 2 weeks' time from now, and if you want to watch it ahead of us, go for it. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Do it. Bye.